This is Jessie, and you're listening to the Curious Cabinet Podcast. So, this week we are continuing the Axeman of New Orleans. I told you before I love New Orleans. This story is just so crazy. Last episode we went over the first 5 attacks, which were Joseph and Catherine Maggio, who both died, Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe. Harriet Lowe or Anna Lowe. Bessemer lived and Harriet died. Mary Schneider, who had lived, Joseph Romano, who had died, Charles, Rosie, and Mary Cordemelia, and Charles and Rosie lived. Mary unfortunately died. She was the little girl. Then we have what the Axeman called it was a letter from hell. It was delivered to the Times-Picayune paper to be published for all of the community to see. And I'm going to read you that letter right now. So this was published in the Times-Picayune on Sunday, March 16th, 1919. He wrote it on March 13th. It says, "From hell to the editor of the Times-Picayune, New Orleans." It's written as this: "Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see it fit, I shall come again and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with the blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way in which they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they've been so utterly stupid so as to amuse not only me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph. But tell them to be aware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they never were born than for them to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel that your police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all the harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse, if I wanted to. If I wished to, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 o'clock earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to the people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose house a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for the people. One thing is certain, and that is some of those persons who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there will be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, And as it will be about time that I have left your homely earth, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish it, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that has ever existed, either in fact or the realm of fancy. The Axeman. One thing that this letter did was get the police agitated. They took this letter very seriously. They wanted to catch this guy, but he had evaded them every single time and left them completely irritated that he was pretty much playing games with them at this point. They increased patrol on March 19th, but came up with nothing new. Within the community, this letter fueled hysteria. On that night, every jazz hall was filled and every home was blasting jazz music, trying to spare themselves from any attack. I'm a huge fan of jazz music, but this brings kind of like a whole sense of mystery and creepiness to jazz music for me now. Like, I didn't know about this letter. I knew about the case, but I didn't know like that this had happened. So it kind of like adds a lot of mystery to jazz music. Seemingly, the letter had worked, and that night there were no murders. There was actually a long gap between this letter and the next murder, since the next one didn't occur until September of 1919. But was it really the Axeman who wrote that letter? Historian Miriam Davis argues that the writer of that letter used language too sophisticated to be the Axeman. This included like the references to Tartarus and his satanic majesty, Francis Joseph. That suggests that the letter really wasn't written by a working class man, but rather someone with some sort of college education. She believes it may have been a journalist or maybe some prankster, or was written specifically by the composer Joseph John Davila, who later wrote the mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa, which was inspired by the letter. The letter turned the Axeman into a cultural phenomenon, and it turned jazz into like a huge symbol of defiance against his terror. So 2 things just to add about this letter. If you don't know what Tartarus is, it's pretty much like a place of torment, like the underworld or hell, and that came from Greek mythology. And Francis Joseph, when he talks about him in the letter, I couldn't figure out like who that person was specifically. There was no I couldn't find a biblical sense or anything like that. So if anybody knows, let me know in the comments. But what I had come up with is that he was a emperor from Austria-Hungary from 1848 to 1960, but there's no proof that he was really referring to him. And some people believe that it's just kind of like he used a powerful name to make it sound like he was otherworldly, because no one really understands who he was referencing at that point in the letter. So it took a long time for the next attack. But on September 2nd, 1919, he didn't actually fully commit a crime, because this was just an attempted attack. So William Carson was a local druggist, which was what they called a pharmacist then. He wasn't Italian, but he was a small business owner. And with all the hype of the Axeman, he decided he'd be better off arming himself. So he slept with his gun under his pillow in case of a possible attack. Around midnight on September 2nd, 1919, the same night as Boca's attack, which is, the following person. I'll get to that. But it was the same night as the next attack. William awoke to an intruder who had chiseled his way through the door panel in the back. He fired his revolver once, causing the man to flee the scene and leaving the axe and the chisel all there. The chiseled door panel was consistent with all of the other attacks. No new evidence had been brought forward, and even though William Carson survived the attack, he didn't have any new information or an eyewitness account. Police searched the area, but there was no trace of any fleeing suspect. This story has spread like wildfire. This was the first known account of anyone scaring off the Axeman where there wasn't any bloodshed. The Times-Picayune praised William as a hero, and it gave some people hope that if they did encounter this man, they could fight him off. It also led to a surge in gun purchases for the home since people were ready to be armed for anything. So this was the attack on the same night, September 2nd, 1919. Steve Boca was a middle-aged Italian-American grocer who lived above his store at 2510 Elysian Field Ave in New Orleans. He was a quiet man and kept to himself, trying to make it as another entrepreneur in the grocery business. On September 2nd, 1919, Steve was attacked in his home around 2 a.m. This was about 2 hours after William Carson's attack. He had been struck in the head, but somehow managed to stagger over to a neighbor's house who called for help. He lived even though the blow to the head caused permanent damage. The killer chiseled through a back door panel and used Steve's axe as a weapon. The scene looked like all the other ones. Blood spattered everywhere, the weapons left behind, and nothing was stolen from the home or the store. It was almost identical to all of the other attacks. Even though Boca survived, he could offer no clear description of the attacker, and no new evidence was found at the scene. The police searched Elysian Avenue, but found no witness or evidence left behind anywhere. This attack clearly belonged to the Axeman, who hadn't attacked in months, but had proved to be active again. Police still had no profile to pursue, which is kind of crazy. Like, I can't believe they didn't put a whole profile together for this guy. But they believed that it was a single person committing these crimes. They had believed the killings had stopped since the publishing of the letter in March, since there was nothing else and there was such a huge gap. And the Italian community kind of started letting their guard down. But this reignited the fears of people, and they started to take other precautions, including arming themselves again. Sarah Laumann was a 19-year-old German-American girl living alone at 2128 2nd Street in New Orleans. She was known to be independent, but little is really known about her occupation or her background. It was less common for women to live alone at this time, but she said she has always felt safe and comfortable in her own home. On September 3rd, 1919, Sarah was attacked in her sleep around 1 a.m. She was struck in the head with the axe, but miraculously survived with severe head trauma, and she had lost a couple of her teeth. Her neighbors were concerned when they hadn't seen her in a couple of days and decided to go check on her. When she didn't answer the door, they broke in and found her unconscious and covered in blood. The axe was found on the front lawn with blood on it, which is rare since usually it was left in the room beside the bed. The intruder had entered through a window, which is also unusual for the Axeman. Nothing was stolen from her home, despite her being somewhat wealthy and having nicer possessions. Sarah was not the usual target. She had no connection to the Italian community and was not a grocer. But police believe that she was attacked due to the vulnerability of being so young and living alone. The New Orleans Police Department searched 2nd Street but found no witnesses. She couldn't remember anything from the attack due to the severe head trauma that she had endured. But back-to-back attacks that had led to sloppy investigative work and much more pressure to catch the killer. Women began staying with family members, and everyone was starting to believe that they could be the target of the Axeman, no matter who they were. And that was the day after the 2 attacks, the one attempted and Steve Boca's attack. So obviously this guy is active again. Mike Pepitone was an Italian-American grocer at 1020 Mary Street. He lived with his wife Esther Albano, and their 6 children above their grocery store. He was known to be a family man and was dedicated to the store to support his growing family. On October 27, 1919, Esther awoke around midnight to a strange noise. She then saw a large man fleeing with an axe. Her husband had been struck multiple times in the head, suffering massive trauma, and was killed instantly. Mike was the only person who was targeted. Esther's screams had startled neighbors who had instantly called the police. Her eyewitness account was vague since she could only really describe the intruder as a large man, but matched the Bruno sisters' description. The attack was consistent with all of the other attacks. A chiseled-out door panel, a blood-covered room, the axe left at the scene that belonged to the victim, and no valuables taken despite there being a sum of cash in the store. There were no other eyewitness accounts, as thankfully the children had been sleeping. There were no trails to where he could have escaped to, and the police searched for vendettas against the grocery, but it led to no leads. This was the last confirmed attack of the Axeman, but left the community in fear and grief. The killings mysteriously came to a halt, leaving everybody walking on eggshells, unsure of when the next attack was going to be or if there was going to be one at all. So the biggest issue with this case is the lack of forensic evidence, the forensic technology. There was no fingerprint data or blood splatter forensics. And they tried to obtain fingerprints, but I think the only one that they had found was smudge, so they couldn't retain any information. There was so much false accusations within these cases, and a lot of bias and discrimination towards the Italians, so police didn't really care as much about trying to help them so much until they really did realize there was more of a serial killer. And then still, I think they kind of slacked off a little bit with these cases. It's also like all the attacks happen at night, so it's difficult to track the person down at night. And it's harder to find witnesses because there was nobody around. Some still speculate that it could have been a mafia vendetta, but there's no proof. Detective Joseph D'Antonio believed that the mafia would have been more precise and left no surviving victims. He, as well as Police Superintendent Frank Mooney, also believed that this was a case of a Jekyll and Hyde type killer who was just normal during the day, probably went to work, and then at night was just driven primarily by bloodlust rather than any type of clear motive. It's also speculated that this was a man called the Cleaver, who was another killer with similar attacks from 1911 to 1917, which they may have been the same person committing these crimes. When Police Superintendent Reynolds had been murdered, I don't know what year it was. Let me see. I didn't jot that down. I think it was like 1917 that he was murdered. He was the one who was investigating the Cleaver cases. They think that it was swept under the rug, and there was no connection made because he was the one who was in charge. Actually, they're not sure if he was killed by the Cleaver. He may have been. Another theory is that the Axeman was a man named Joseph Manfredi, who was an Italian immigrant living in New Orleans. He was a small-time criminal and known to have done some mafia work as well. It's believed that he was shot and killed by Mike Pepitone's widow, Esther, in Los Angeles in 1921. Most say that there is no substantial evidence to support that, but maybe if she saw him that night that, her husband was killed, she saw him leaving, and she recognized him, maybe she hunted him down. He might have recognized her. Who knows? Who knows what happened there? But then that would have tied you to the mafia thing, and I don't think that was it. Then there, are people who believe that this wasn't a single person, but multiple people who were committing the crimes were just like copycats as well. Whoever it was, There has never been any sign of the killer since. The tale of the Axeman lives on in many different movies, documentaries, TV shows. Like I know American Horror Story did an episode about the Axeman because when they do the New Orleans stuff, and tons of books. A great book to read that has a ton of information is The Axeman of New Orleans, A True Story by Miriam Davis. I got a lot of good information from that, and she really, really did hard work putting that book together. It was great. If you're ever in New Orleans, take a ghost tour because I'm sure they will tell you the story of the Axeman, and I'm sure they'll take you to some of the places that, you know, there was a crimes committed and stuff, so you won't be disappointed. But anyway, tune into next week's episode. If you haven't already, find me on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks, guys.